Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest podcast of the Independent Activist. I'm Fra Hughes in Belfast, and today we are joined by Nigel McCollum in London. Nigel previously worked for the United Nations, he worked for the Commonwealth, and latterly he was involved in a think tank for Latin America. Nigel, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll just kind of give a brief outline as to what the podcast is. I recently went to an event at Failure, and Failure is promoted as one of the biggest community festivals in Western Europe. It gets funding from different international bodies. It's a very vibrant festival. It has music, it has art, it has culture, and it has lectures, and it has a political theme. Because of its historic background connected to the troubles here, the conflict between 1969 and 1998. So I went to attend this lecture, Human Rights Memorial Lecture, at St Mary's College in Belfast, and it was addressed by Fionnuala Ní Amhlainn. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Táimé ag Fóileáin in Gaelic. I'm learning Irish. So hopefully Fionnuala will forgive me if I mispronounced her name. But she was the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Syria, I think from 2017 until 2023. So having been in Syria myself on several occasions, I went through on two convoys to Gaza, 2010 and 2014. I was also a member of a delegate to the World Federation Trade Union Conference in Damascus on two occasions, and I have friends in Syria. So I went along to hear what this lady was going to say. So she was introduced as having been this rapporteur for the UN for Syria, and that she...
And counter-terrorism. Her role was counter-terrorism and human rights.
Okay, buddy.
Yeah.
So she introduced herself as the rapporteur. She said that when she had been nominated, I believe, by both Britain and Ireland as representatives from those respective regimes, that she took on the job and then went on to sit on 9 counter-terrorism committees. Now, that kind of shocked me in itself. Human rights lawyer, rapporteur for the UN, sitting on 9 counter-terrorism committees. I don't know where the connection is between human rights and counter-terrorism. It seems like an oxymoron to me. But she described, basically set the scene that, the Arab Spring in 2011 led to, demonstrations in Syria, which were brutally repressed by the Syrian Arab Republic, and that this led to the confrontation that came out of that, something that I personally do not agree with, but I was there to hear what the woman had to say. So she talked about visiting Syria. She talked about visiting the prisons and really the concentration camps run by the SDF in the northeast of Syria. And she mentioned about the different groups that were occupying Syria at that time. She mentioned the Americans were there, the SDF, ISIS and stuff. She never mentioned the Golan Heights, which has been occupied since 1967. And that struck me straight away as a member of the audience. Well, you're mentioning everybody else. You're not mentioning Israel. So, a bit of a shock there, but I let that go. So she went on to explain her role. And then at the end, in summation, she said, basically, like, we're very lucky to live in the societies we live in. And as soon as I heard that, I totally agreed. I thought, like, my God, look what's happening in West Asia. Look at the death and the destruction in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, and also the ongoing conflicts in Iraq. And I thought to myself, she's 100% right. But then she followed that by saying, can you imagine living in Russia or China? And I was absolutely shocked. To me, this was like something you'd hear at a NATO platform, or, a US congressman saying. It was totally had nothing to do with Syria, nothing to do with what she was talking about. So I was kind of shocked. And on reflection, I thought that the whole kind of structure of her lecture, which was based on her personal experience and the information she had at hand as a rapporteur between 2017 and 2023. It's like something that you would have read in the New York Times, or something that you might have read in papers that, or on one level, telling you what's happening on the ground, but on another level, I don't know, it seemed to be just, there was an equivalence, everyone's as bad as everybody else. They're all guilty of human rights. We all need to do something to bring about, some form of resolution. And in the Q&A, someone asked her, what is the potential future for Syria? And she mentioned Giuliani saying that basically the jury's out. We're going to have to wait and see what he does. And I'm sitting thinking, this is a man who was the head of ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq at one stage. He's one of the people personally responsible for the fall of the Syrian Arab Republic, a man who has been backed, in my opinion, by Israel, backed by America, backed by NATO, backed by MI6. So to say the jury's out to see what he's going to do, it just left me of a feeling that, while we're being told of the role that was portrayed between 2017 and 2023, we didn't really get the context of what was happening on the ground. So I came away quite kind of disillusioned by what I heard. And Nigel, sorry to keep you so long with that introduction.
There's another thing I just noticed. She's a UN Special Rapporteur, and she mentions China and Russia, 2 permanent members of the Security Council. It's a bit loaded. I mean, technically they're your boss.
Okay, I don't really know about that. But let's get into the fact that you were also in Queen's University
in
Belfast at the same time. That
law, though. I was doing anthropology. She was in law and I was anthropology.
Okay, then. So you might have crossed paths when you were in university in Belfast together, but a part of her kind of employment history that I was totally unaware of, that I didn't know about when I was at the lecture, and the other people at the lecture wouldn't have been aware of this either, outside of perhaps the people who invited her to speak. So I'd just like, to hear more about her employment history pre 2017. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just, when you told me about the talk, when we were talking this week, and I said to them, you're telling me how she was introduced. Given that she's an academic professor, and she was introduced by Professor Bill Rolston from the University of Ulster, emeritus professor. It seemed odd to me, because I asked you, they must have mentioned, Jerusalem. No. After she was awarded a PhD in 98, she was appointed as a visiting professor, an associate professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And she stayed there for 2 or 3 years. And then, which is, a great achievement, but an interesting one to be omitted from the introduction to a talk like that. Because then she was appointed back to the Hebrew University, 2011 to 2012, as a visiting professor again. I thought these were things that should have been raised at the introduction to her talk, given that you're in West Belfast, and 2, you're talking about Syria. It's quite relevant. Israel's a key player. And I told you who she's married to. Should I tell them now? Shall I mention it?
Yes, buddy, go ahead. Yeah, well, I think it's relevant to know the context of the person who's speaking.
Versions, everyone's entitled to marry who they want. She's married to Professor Oren Gross, another great international lawyer. But at the time she was in Jerusalem, he was an officer in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in their legal division. And he was actually, as an officer, negotiating with the Palestinians on ostensibly issues around economic issues. But he was a key player. He's also, interestingly, had a blog column in the Times of Israel. And if you look at those, he's unequivocally presents himself as a Zionist, unequivocally. So I just thought, interesting that when she was presented in West Belfast this week, her links to the State of Israel, to the Hebrew University, to a senior IDF officer, not mentioned at all. Just made me think that's a bit odd, because the whole point in academic life is to, even if you're publishing a paper, you're not going to write a paper against, ostensibly against GM crops. If previous funding was done by Monsanto, you're going to have to declare that. Previously, I've been funded by. So it was interesting that that was omitted completely. Or Israeli links, I think.
Yes, well, I was there on the evening. I would have liked to have known that this historical context was there. I mean, I was listening to someone who was presented as a human rights lawyer who'd been involved in Syria. I had no idea that she'd been to. I believe that university is built on stolen Palestinian land from 1967,
Yeah.
and that to get such a high-profile position in a Hebrew speaking university not long after getting your PhD, if that's the correct timeline, or even before that, from Queen's University. It just sheds a different light potentially on what was said on the evening. Not casting any aspersions, we're just trying to create a fuller picture of the person who gave the lecture. So you've mentioned the university, you've mentioned that she then married a person who was an officer in the IDF, who was involved in some of the economic peace talks with the Palestinians. And what happened after that? Where did she go after the Hebrew University?
After the Hebrew University, she became a visiting fellow at Princeton.
Okay, America, yeah.
And Minnesota as well. She was also then came back to Northern Ireland to set up the Transitional Justice Institute at the University of Ulster. Ulster University is it called now.
Okay.
And that's interesting too, because if you look at the staff when she joined, the director of the Law Institute at the Hebrew University, where she was employed in '98, immediately after her PhD, Professor David Kretzmer, was appointed to Jordanstown as a full-time staff member. And then at the same time, her husband got a role as a visiting chair in the Transitional Justice Institute. And that's interesting in itself too. I mean, there's no legal requirement for these jobs to be advertised, but it certainly shows you how in this area across the world and in these sort of echelons, it's all networks and contacts. And I thought what struck me is because when she arrived in Jerusalem in '98, I arrived in Gaza in '99. It's like I'm following her, but I wasn't. And I was thinking at the Transitional Justice Institute, when you're looking at, the peace process in Northern Ireland, and you're considering, concurrently the peace process between the State of Israel and Palestine. Interesting that there's these three academics with links to the Hebrew University or Israel. And that made me, and I checked in, not one Palestinian scholar was there at the same time. So I just thought on that area alone, the University of Ulster there's a bit of bias going on there, actually, to my mind. Because back home, we know that the Palestinian flag is flown by the Nationalist Republican community because there's a real solidarity there, has been for decades. And then we also know that the loyalists suddenly flew the Israeli flag, not even knowing what it stood for. It was just because they knew it was opposite to that one. But it's the opposite of the Palestinian civil flag. So in that context, you don't have to drive far out of Jordanstown campus to see the flags, Palestine and Israel. But to think the Transitional Justice Institute only had two Israeli academics in law, but no Palestinian, seems very odd to me. Very odd. And then if we add that in, the director of the transition, the associate director, Fanula herself, had spent 4 to 5 years over 2 terms at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which of course the Hebrew University is founded as a Zionist institution. It was supposed to be the Hebrew University for the whole Jewish diaspora. And as you mentioned too there, all credit to her. She must have had a sterling CV. Because in the 1990s, to get a work visa and to be employed at a Hebrew-speaking university when you're not Jewish and you don't speak Hebrew, that's quite a feat under Israeli citizenship laws. So she must have been a really stellar CV to get around all those hurdles.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say there, and I not being, in the room to hear these visiting professors at the Ulster University, I don't know if their remit was on Palestine, Israeli human rights, or the political discourse at that time. So,
It was on transitional justice, and I mean, I think that's. You can't just look at Northern Ireland. You have to look at, if you look at some of the stuff they do, it's across the world.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure, but I think it's a bizarre coincidence that both her, the person who employed her in the Hebrew University and her husband both end up in the transitional justice.
Again, it's not versions on them. It's just that should have been mentioned, because the chair of your event, Bill Rolston, was also in that Transitional Justice Institute. So there was a perfect opportunity in the introduction to say not only Fionnuala, but David Kretzmer, Oren Gross, all with thanks to her time at the Hebrew University. But that was totally omitted. And certainly in any academic circles, that's not on at all. I mean, you can't accuse one of your students of plagiarism if you as an academic are guilty of omission.
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, I've seen her CV and it's very impressive, all the different places she's worked in, the different bodies that she's worked for on women's rights and stuff. And they actually take the time to say all that would have taken up probably half of the lecture in itself. But to put things in context with this Israeli connection, and also the fact that Israel has been occupying the Golan Heights since 1967, and the fact wasn't mentioned that subsequent to the fall of the Syrian Arab Republic, Israel is now the Zionist entity 20 kilometers from Damascus, and has taken over huge swathes of Syria.
And also, I mean, there's the aspect as well. We know since the early 2000s, it was exposed that Israel has been actively involved in Syria via the Kurds in the north. That was a 2004 article by Seymour Hersh that exposed that. So to ignore Israel entirely at that event seems an interesting omission.
Yeah, to be fair now, I mean, if you're talking about human rights violations in Syria, you have to include the occupation of the Golan Heights and the human rights violations that occur there, probably on a daily basis, even if it's just some form of apartheid that's being kind of performed every day. And then there's been the bombings of Syria all the way through from 2017 to 2023, which weren't touched upon. And they would be acts of violation of human rights, never mind international human law. So we've gone through to the transitional justice. What happened after that? What's her roles been since that?
Well, she went back to Jerusalem, didn't she, as a visiting professor, but also then very lucrative position at George Soros's Open Society. She became the chair for a number of years of his International Women's Program. So in charge of a multi-billion-dollar program that funds the George Soros agenda across the world, particularly on women. Of course, many countries have kicked the Soros Foundation out.
Yeah, Russia and Turkey, I believe, are among two of them, yeah.
India and Uganda as well. I mean, listen, it's well documented. Everyone knows George Soros has an agenda. And it's not far-fetched to believe that if you're a chair of one of his programs, you're not going to veer far from his agenda to stay that long in your role. And she stepped down in 2017 because of the UN Special Rapporteur role. So yeah, George Soros, I think that's an interesting one too. You said it wasn't mentioned.
Not that I can recount. Obviously, I didn't record the lecture in itself and in its entirety. I didn't record any of it at all. I wasn't expecting just for it to go the way it went. So everything I'm saying is from memory. But I started.
With 6 years, she was chair of his International Women's Program.
Okay.
Which is another great job. But I mean, people are entitled to know that because Soros is not a neutral philanthropist by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I agree with you. George Soros has his own political agenda. He has been accused of being involved in some type of colour revolutions across the globe and regimes that maybe aren't in line with American foreign policy, or actually aren't in line with George Soros's foreign policy. Now, because she was on the board, doesn't mean she was following his direction. Obviously, there's an ethos of the foundation, but that ethos is probably.
Oh no, you have to. If you're chair of the board, you have to follow the. You have to follow the organization's aims
Ethos.
and yeah, you have
That's
to.
what I'm trying to explain.
She's
She'll have been following
the board. She's the chair, so you might have dissenting voices on the board, but the chair has to.
Yes, I'm just saying. I'm not saying that she followed George Soros's directions. I'm saying that as chair of the board, she would have followed the foundational aspirations of the foundation, which would have been set up by George Soros with his money and potentially with his political inclinations as to how the world should work. So.
I mean, it's a great position to get. Not many people can say they've been appointed by George Soros to head up one of his.
Absolutely, and then she went on to become the Special Rapporteur for Syria. So that might be seen as a conflict of interest. So she maybe stepped down as the chair of the board for the Soros Foundation.
And which is, yeah, I didn't know that, but I mean, I guess being affiliated to George Soros and being a UN Special Rapporteur, there's a big conflict there.
Yeah, well, it's an assumption I'm making on my behalf. I have to say that because we're having this conversation, if there's anything factually incorrect, Fanula is welcome to come onto the podcast.
And there's another fact that's interesting.
Repudiate anything that's been said.
I mean, they mentioned that it was thanks to universities in America and also Queen's in Belfast that she was able to take the Special Rapporteur job because they're unpaid. You get minimal funding for expenses and that sort of thing, but they're unpaid. And that's interesting too, because she was never a professor at Queen's before. But from 2017, she appears as a professor of law. So that's another, I mean, for me, it was very interesting because that's a ghost employee job. You know, she was never teaching classes at Queen's. She wasn't giving lectures. She wasn't doing tutorial. But they appointed her as a professor to pay her so she could do the Special Rapporteur job. And that sort of, I suppose that sort of hurts a little bit because, of course, during that period, that whole period from this century, there's been so many cuts. I mean, the department I was in, anthropology and ethnomusicology, it's been decimated, really decimated. So many departments have closed. Scholastic philosophy's gone. Italian has gone. I mean, it's just decimated with staff cuts. Not just academic staff cuts, but administrative and technician staff cuts. And yet there's Queen's University with a £12 million running deficit at the time, appointing someone to a ghost role as professor of law, which is essentially an honorary position but paid. Sort of galls a bit.
Yeah, well, I have to say she did actually say that she was grateful for the fact that both universities helped support her financially so that she could continue this unpaid role. But then she went on to say that, like her role was unpaid. We'll call it a department for the sake of conversation, didn't have a budget, for research purposes and for personnel, but that she was able to accept funding from different organizations. I don't know if there were NGOs or what exactly their role was, how much was given. Questions I maybe should have asked at the end, but I had so many questions going through my head.
That's another separate question. I mean, that's one of the murky, opaque areas of the UN. There's no requirement for special rapporteurs to lay out for the public where they get their funding from.
Well, that's very, very, very important because she mentioned who it was, and as I didn't record it, then I can't from memory recall. But if I'd known and if I'd recorded it, we could have done some research on those foundations and NGOs that provided that funding. So maybe just in conclusion, a couple of things. Did you mention?
You mentioned about funding. When she got the job in Jerusalem in '98, the group who funded that new Center for International Law was the Minerva Group, which is part of the Max Planck Institute, which is Max Planck. The Minerva is the great guilt that Germany has. So there's the Minerva Institute all over the world, but this one is specifically German-Israeli cooperation. And that's been under a lot of criticism lately, because there was a visiting at the Minerva Institute in Germany, a visiting distinguished Lebanese Australian professor at the beginning of the brutal genocide against Gaza. He was openly critical, and they fired him. They fired him. And they're also, Minerva Institute is under fire as well, because a lot of the funding the Minerva Institute has given to Israeli scientists has been used for technology and armaments in the genocide. So the Minerva Institute itself is not exactly neutral. And they funded the Center of Law in Jerusalem. Just saying.
Yes, and that visiting Lebanese Australian professor, he was attacked in Die Welt, the German publication, for something that he put on Twitter. Yep, and he claims that what they wrote was half-truths, lies, and propaganda in order to have him removed, because he's, he called out the genocide, he called out what's happening in Gaza. But
well, it's not. I mean, even Baroness Jenny Tung, she'd even said, she'd openly said it in the House. The power of the Zionist lobby is intense, and it just shows you the hold they have on the Minerva Institute, that someone dares criticize Israel in the face of a genocide that's unfolding before our very eyes on every screen. He's not, as a professor, he's not allowed to say anything about it. Otherwise, he loses his job, sent back to Australia. Quite crazy, really. And that's a man with, Lebanese, he's from the region. He's more than entitled to have a view. So yeah, interesting.
You also mentioned that Fionnuala was given an award. Is that right, in Israel?
Yes, but the Yigal, this is very murky too. I cannot find the citation. She was awarded the Yigal Allon Prize, which is named after, he's a politician going back to the sort of Golda Meir years. I think he was also at one stage interim prime minister. He was deputy prime minister, but before that, he was a member of the Haganah.
Terrorist gang.
And he founded the Palmach, the founder of the Palmach.
Another terrorist gang.
That is awarded for individuals for an outstanding contribution to the state. But yet her citation I cannot find. What contribution did she make that gave her the Yigal Allon Prize? Talking about prizes, 2024, King Charles made her an honorary King's Counsel, an honorary KC. He had a big lavish ceremony in London. She was awarded honorary KC by the Lord Chancellor for various services to law in Northern Ireland. Work on the Bill of Rights, which kind of, again, stuck in the back of my throat, because you might have written a few policy documents on it, but we're still waiting for the Bill of Rights.
Listen, I think that's a perfect way to conclude things. This started out as, this is what I heard at St. Mary's College University in West Belfast. And there was no context of these connections with the Israeli Zionist educational governmental regime. And we end up finding out that she was given an award by the Israelis, a very prestigious award. And when you recognize, the background of that in itself, it's something I personally wouldn't have touched with a barge pole, with the connections to terrorism. The British called the Haganah and the Palmach terrorists, people who were involved in the mass expulsion in 1948 of 750,000 Palestinians in the Nakba, people who were potentially involved in the massacres of Deir ez-Zin, when I went into that village just outside of Jerusalem, which is on the J1 corridor, which I visited, murdered every man, woman and child in the village. Those connections, for someone who claims to be a human rights lawyer, to accept a praise like that, to me, I find unfathomable. So the whole thing,
in his name, that's the thing, it's in his name, and he's the founder of Palmach, not just a member. Was a member of Haganah, but a founder of Palmach. Wasn't it Haganah who assassinated a British minister in Jerusalem?
I know there was a Swedish guy who was assassinated because he was calling out what's happening then. I don't know if he was a prince or part of the Swedish government. But, the whole idea of this was, behind this was, I went to the lecture. I came out kind of stunned. I was like I don't know, like a lamb in the headlights of an oncoming car. I was just kind of shocked at what I'd heard. And then when you get that background, you know, there are questions as to why that wasn't elucidated in the room, why there wasn't like a caveat put out. And by the way, there are these, even if it said there are these connections with the Zionist regime and educational system, and there was this award, but we can assure you that this hasn't had any influence on the professional aspects of Fanula's position as the Special UN Rapporteur for Syria. But I have to question, you know, not her professionalism. I just have to question, like, why weren't we told this? Why wasn't this put out in the public domain? Why does it take someone like you, Nigel, to do that research in the background, to have me saying, well, like, why weren't we told this? You know, why wasn't this put out there? You know, I think it's worthwhile to say what we have said for people to understand, you know, what's going on.
As academics, they know it, because when I was and even when I was never finished, but when I was doing my PhD, you're told about this. You know, you have to be clear about your affiliations. Even if you're writing a journal article, you have to write any conflict of interest at the bottom. You have to mention it. You cannot get away with it. And yet this is being completely omitted. And it's relevant, because she's not the Special Rapporteur for East Timor, not the Special Rapporteur for climate change in the Pacific. We're talking about, you know, that region. And to deny the fact that the State of Israel is a massive player, covertly and openly, it's ridiculous. Just think a little.
Yeah, it was as if they weren't there, to be honest. If you'd mentioned the Americans and the Turks and ISIS and the SDF, not mention the continuing occupation of the Golan Heights, and not mention what's happened to, I suppose you can say her remit's up to 23, so she doesn't have to say anything post her post as a UN rapporteur. But then when she goes on to say in the Q&A that the jury's out in Jelani, we'll have to give them time to see what's happening. Well,
the chair and the organization, they have to understand, as an academic, context is critical. It's critical in academia. Context is critical. And by deliberately
transparency is critical.
Omitting that context, so it frames her as this radical, neutral, authentic academic. Then maybe the true picture shows, in a way. And that's a disservice, not just to the audience, but to the integrity of academic discourse itself.
And the failure for not pointing that out. Nigel, thank you very much. I hope to chat with you again. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for your forensic investigation.
Just because, you know, I know that her name, it's interesting that she was at Queen's the same time as me. And as she was in Jerusalem, I was landing in Gaza. It's bizarre. But I've no plans to go to Minnesota. So I'm not following.
Nigel, thank you again.
All right, cheers for that. All the best. Bye.